37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, the polished luxury of a transatlantic night flight had transformed into something far less glamorous. The New York to Paris service was supposed to be a haven for executives, diplomats, and celebrities who paid small fortunes for privacy and peace. Instead, the silence of the first-class cabin had been shattered for hours by the relentless cries of one tiny passenger. 8-month-old Clara Blackwood had not stopped screaming since the wheels had lifted from JFK. Her face was crimson with exhaustion, her tiny fists clenched as if fighting invisible battles, her lungs pouring out a wail that rattled every champagne flute and silenced every polite conversation. Passengers who had planned to sleep away the 6-hour journey now sat rigid in their wide seats, pressing noise, canceling headphones tighter against their ears, casting sideways glares at the source of their misery. At the center of it all sat Adrian Blackwood, a man whose name graced the covers of financial magazines and whose fortune could buy islands. Tonight, however, he looked nothing like the image of the untouchable billionaire CEO. His tie was loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled, and his normally steady hands trembled as he bounced his inconsolable daughter against his chest. He whispered hoarse words of comfort that were drowned in the child's screams. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with sleeplessness, and his polished mask of control was cracking in full view of strangers. Adrian had tried everything he knew. He had offered bottles she refused, turned on the expensive white noise application on his phone, adjusted the reclined seat into every possible angle, even strapped her into the sleek baby carrier his assistant had recommended. Nothing worked. The cries only grew sharper, echoing through the plush cabin like an alarm that no one could turn off. The lead flight attendant, Veronica, glided between aisles, her smile polite yet brittle, her eyes promising swift restoration of order. She crouched at Adrian's side with professional efficiency, offering suggestions, offering to hold the infant herself, offering to bring soothing cloths. Each attempt failed. Clara's wails cut through even the thick carpet and heavy curtains that separated first class from the rest of the plane. A businessman in seat 1A sighed loudly, muttering about ruined meetings in the morning. A famous actress buried her face in a pillow and hissed to her assistant that she would demand a refund. 2 younger passengers in designer clothes rolled their eyes and pulled out their phones, one of them whispering that the baby had screamed for almost 3 hours straight. Adrian felt each judgmental stare like a blade. He was used to boardroom battles, hostile investors, governments waiting for his statements, but nothing had prepared him for the helplessness of a father with a screaming child at 37,000 feet in the air. His heart thudded as he remembered the nights when his late wife had once held this same child, humming softly to lull her to sleep. Now that voice was gone, and he was left alone to face the storm. Clara arched her back, her legs kicking her small body, trembling with distress. Adrian checked his luxury smartwatch, scrolling to the lullaby his wife had recorded before her passing. A gentle female voice filled the small speaker near his wrist. For a moment he dared to hope, but the sound only seemed to agitate Clara more. The cries rose higher, more piercing, until even the veteran attendants exchanged nervous glances. The cabin that was designed as an oasis now resembled a prison. Every passenger was trapped, forced to endure the unending noise. Adrian felt sweat bead along his brow as he rocked his daughter faster, whispering her name. He pressed his lips to her soft hair, pleading silently for a miracle. His empire could buy solutions to every problem but this. A mother in the second row shifted uncomfortably, clutching the hand of her sleeping child, glaring as if to say that wealth should have provided competence. A diplomat shook his head and scribbled irritated notes. Someone muttered that a billionaire ought to hire better nannies. Adrian heard it all. He had no nanny on this flight, no assistant who could step in, no one but himself. And he was failing. Time stretched cruelly. Minutes became eternities measured in cries. The plane hummed steadily through the night, yet inside the cabin, chaos reigned. Passengers pressed call buttons. Veronica gave Adrian a look that was still polite, but increasingly strained. She had seen meltdowns before, but never one that fractured an entire luxury cabin. Adrian adjusted Clara once more, pressing her close against his chest, trying to breathe slowly, trying to hide the panic clawing at him. His mind was sharp when negotiating billion-dollar deals, but here it was fogged with fear and fatigue. He imagined the headlines if someone decided to post the scene online. Billionaire undone by a baby. He closed his eyes briefly, the humiliation almost unbearable. But the humiliation was nothing compared to the fear. Claire's cries carried a pitch he remembered too well. They reminded him of hospital alarms, of doctors rushing when his wife's body had failed to recover from childbirth. He could not lose again. He could not fail again. Another passenger rose, frustration written in every movement, demanding that something be done. Veronica promised that the crew was handling it. Her voice calm but clipped. She turned to Adrian, lowering her tone, suggesting he let the staff take Clara for a moment. He shook his head sharply. She was his daughter, his responsibility, and he would not hand her to strangers. The cries continued. Hours had passed since takeoff, but it felt like days. The glow of cabin lights softened, casting long shadows. The polished wood gleamed dully. The champagne glasses stood untouched. The once comfortable leather seats felt like cages as tension wrapped around every passenger. Adrian pressed his forehead against the small crown of his daughter's head, whispering through clenched teeth that he was here, that she was safe, that he would not give up. But Clara screamed louder, her tiny body rejecting every attempt. He clenched his jaw, feeling a crack in his own composure that no boardroom rival had ever witnessed. The billionaire who could command armies of employees, who could shift markets with a single announcement, sat powerless in seat 2D. His daughter's cries filled the night sky. The cabin had become a battlefield where silence was the prize, and every attempt to win had failed. Far behind the velvet curtain in the dim rose of economy, unnoticed eyes were watching. Adrian Blackwood was a man whose very name evoked power in financial circles, the youngest tech billionaire to take a startup public, and the face of innovation that reshaped industries. Yet none of those accolades meant anything tonight. His neatly styled dark hair was now tousled, his shirt wrinkled, and his usually composed demeanor cracked beneath the relentless pressure of his daughter's cries. The world saw a commanding figure whose decisions moved markets, but the man sitting in seat 2D was not a titan of industry. He was a widower, a father alone, carrying wounds that money could not heal. He still remembered the sterile white hospital room where his wife Evelyn had slipped away hours after giving birth. He remembered the way doctors avoided his eyes when hope ran out. The way the lullaby she had recorded for their child became the last trace of her voice. Since that day, Adrian had vowed to do everything alone. He refused to rely on nannies too often, refused to let assistants raise his daughter while he signed contracts. His colleagues admired his control, his investors admired his focus, but inside, he knew he was barely surviving each day. And tonight, that fragile image was shattering in the most public way possible. Clara, only 8 months old, had always been sensitive. Pediatricians mentioned acid reflux, suggested dietary changes, hinted at sensory processing struggles, but none of the advice seemed to work consistently. At home, she had nights where she wailed until morning. Nights when Adrian paced the penthouse balcony, whispering desperate words as the city glittered below. He was not surprised she cried now. What surprised him was how powerless he felt, surrounded by strangers who expected perfection. To them, he was the billionaire who could solve anything, and yet he could not calm a baby. In the rows of economy class, separated by heavy burgundy curtains, sat Elodie Laurent, 25 years old, traveling alone with a worn leather satchel and a notebook filled with sketches and observations. She had the look of someone who had seen more than her years suggested. Born in Lyon, she had grown up in a modest apartment where her mother worked double shifts as a seamstress, and her father left before she turned 10. She had raised her younger brother during those long evenings, rocking him through his own reflux episodes, reading borrowed medical books from the local library when her family could not afford specialists. What she learned was not from classrooms, but from survival. Elodie had saved for years to afford this trip across the Atlantic, working in childcare centers, volunteering at a community clinic, always drawn to children whose needs were misunderstood. Her ticket was economy class, the cheapest she could manage, and she clutched it with a sense of gratitude and hope. She was on her way to London for a cultural exchange program that could open doors to future studies. For now, she wanted nothing more than to sit quietly, review her notes, and prepare for the opportunities ahead. Yet the cries from first class tore through every plan. Unlike others around her who groaned or pressed pillows to their ears, Elodie listened. To her trained ear, those cries carried patterns she recognized. The arching back, the swallow, the pitch of the sound signs she had once memorized in order to save her brother from endless pain. Her body tensed with memory. She pressed her palm against the compression gloves she wore, a habit from years of helping children with sensory issues, and fought the urge to rise. She knew what was happening on the other side of that curtain, knew that the expensive attempts to soothe the child were making the problem worse, not better. But what right did she have to cross into a space that was never meant for her? First class was a world apart. Behind the thick curtains, the seats reclined into beds. Champagne-flowed meals arrived on porcelain plates. Economy passengers like Elodie were supposed to stay invisible, grateful just to be on board. The divide was not only physical, but symbolic. Wealthy passengers expected silence, comfort, obedience. Anyone who disrupted that order was seen as a problem, not a person. In first class, Adrian was living that reality. He felt the eyes of those who believed their ticket price entitled them to perfection. To them, his daughter's cries were not the expression of a vulnerable human life, but an inconvenience that tarnished their purchase. He knew they whispered about him, knew they thought money should have solved this. Yet no amount of wealth could erase the sound of grief in his child's lungs. Veronica, the lead flight attendant, represented the rigid authority of the airline. Her voice was smooth, her uniform pristine, her every movement designed to maintain control. Yet behind her professional facade flickered irritation. She whispered to a junior attendant that wealthy passengers did not pay to endure chaos. She promised Adrian they were trained for every situation, that he should let them manage. But Adrian shook his head each time. His daughter was not a passenger to be managed. She was his last connection to Evelyn. He could not surrender her to strangers, no matter how desperate he became. From her seat in economy, Elodie scribbled a note in the margin of her journal. She wrote down the pattern of cries, the possible triggers, the solution she knew would help. She shut the notebook quickly, cheeks flushed. What would people think if she dared to suggest something? She was only a tourist, a foreigner, someone with no credentials. Her accent alone might make them dismiss her. Still, she could not look away from the curtain, could not ignore the memory of her brother gasping as she once struggled to hold him upright. She heard passengers in economy mutter about the rich father who could not control his child, about how unfair it was to pay for seats near the dividing wall. She felt the sting of judgment that mirrored what Adrian endured in first class. The conflict was not just a crying baby, it was the raw exposure of class lines. In one cabin sat power and wealth demanding silence. In the other sat ordinary people, resigned to endurance. Between them, a curtain symbolized all the barriers society builds. And in that gap existed two people who did not yet know they would need each other. Adrian the billionaire, who feared he was failing as a father. Elodie the French tourist, who carried knowledge born of hardship. The cries of Clara filled the air like a desperate summons. The night flight was far from over, and the real battle was only beginning. The cries did not subside. If anything, they grew sharper. With every mile, the aircraft pushed eastward. The first-class cabin, once hushed with the sound of clinking glasses and the soft hum of engines, had become a theater of frustration. Adrian shifted Clara in his arms again, trying to mimic the soothing movements he had read about in countless articles, but his hands shook from exhaustion. He pressed her tiny back against his chest, bouncing gently, whispering reassurances, yet her screams only intensified. The luxury cabin around him seemed to shrink with each passing second. Passengers had begun pressing call buttons demanding attention. Veronica appeared swiftly, her polished smile in place, but her eyes betrayed the strain. She bent low to Adrian, her tone calm, but edged with authority, suggesting once more that the crew take the infant to a quieter space. Adrian refused instantly, his voice hoarse but firm, insisting that he alone would care for his daughter. His refusal was met with a chorus of sighs and mutters. The businessman in seat 1A leaned forward and snapped that he had a presentation in the morning worth millions, and that he expected rest. The actress nearby pulled a silk mask over her face and hissed at her assistant to document the ordeal for future complaints. Another passenger whispered that billionaires could buy entire aircraft, so why subject everyone else to this misery? Adrian felt every word sink into him like lead. He stared down at Clara, her small face twisted with pain, her cries echoing in his ears louder than any boardroom confrontation. His body tensed with helplessness, sweat dampening his collar as he tried to summon calm where none existed. He reached once more for his smartwatch, replaying Evelyn's recorded lullaby. The gentle voice that had once soothed him now felt like salt in an open wound, as Clara wailed louder, arching away from the sound, as if rejecting the ghost of the mother she would never know. Veronica straightened, adjusting her blazer, her smile brittle. She whispered something to a junior attendant about maintaining standards of phrase that carried more weight than her outward politeness suggested. Adrian caught the glance, knew what it meant. His daughter was not just a crying baby, she was now officially a problem. He bounced Clara harder, desperate, ignoring the ache in his arms. Her tiny fists flailed. Her legs kicked wildly, her sobs turning ragged with exhaustion. Each passenger seemed to grow more restless, shifting, muttering, exchanging looks of solidarity against the man who should have had all the resources in the world. In the dimmed lights of first class, the polished veneer of civility was cracking. Adrian's throat tightened as he remembered Evelyn's last words, whispered with a weak smile, as she touched Clara's cheek in the hospital. "Promise me you will never let her feel alone." He had promised, but tonight he feared he was breaking it. Veronica returned with a warmed towel and a forced cheerfulness, suggesting again that the crew was trained for infant care. Adrian's jaw clenched as he shook his head. He did not trust them, not now, not with Clara screaming like her life depended on it. The murmurs around him grew louder, the air heavier. The luxury cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a cage where judgment pressed down on him from every direction. Clara's cries pierced through the thick carpet and heavy curtains, carrying even into economy where Elodie sat frozen, heart-pounding. She could hear the signs, clearly hear the distress pattern, and recognized what was wrong. Her mind screamed that she had the answer, that she could help, but fear held her back. Meanwhile, Adrian's hands trembled harder as he rocked Clara, whispering apologies into her hair, his own breath uneven. He could handle the loss of money, the loss of reputation, even the anger of investors. But he could not bear the thought that he was failing the one person who mattered most. The cabin had become a battlefield, not of wealth or power, but of patience and despair, and Adrian knew he was losing. From her cramped seat in economy, Elodie Laurent could not escape the piercing cries that tore through the velvet curtain. The sound was different from the complaints of tired passengers or the occasional disruptions she had endured on past journeys. This was sharper, more desperate, more patterned. Where others heard only chaos, her trained ear picked up rhythm and signs. The baby's wails rose and fell with a distinct pitch, each cry punctuated by a swallow, each arch of the back signaling discomfort that went far beyond ordinary fussiness. She closed her eyes, and in an instant she was no longer on a plane, but back in her childhood apartment in Lyon. She was 16 again, pacing the narrow hallway, with her baby brother Luke in her arms, his tiny body writhing in the same way, his cries splitting the night, as her exhausted mother worked late shifts at the seamstress factory. Doctors had called it reflux, offered generic advice they could not afford to follow. Elodie had learned through trial and error, by observing every detail of Luke's reactions, by reading second-hand medical pamphlets by sheer necessity. She remembered holding him upright against her chest until dawn, whispering lullabies she barely believed in, experimenting with angles and pressure points until finally he settled. She had not just cared for him, she had studied him, committing every sound and movement to memory, because his survival depended on her persistence. Now as Clara's cries filled the cabin, Elodie felt the same recognition pulse through her. This was not random fussiness, this was the same painful cycle. The baby's father, no matter how wealthy, was making the same mistakes her own mother had once made, cradling her too, flat bouncing too aggressively, increasing the very pressure that worsened the condition. Elodie's hands tightened in her lap, her compression gloves a silent reminder of all the nights she had spent with sensory-sensitive children at the community center. Her heart pounded with the urge to act, but fear kept her rooted. She was just a tourist, a girl from Lyon with no credentials, no authority. In first class sat billionaires, politicians, celebrities, people who would dismiss her with a glance at her cheap ticket. She imagined approaching, offering help, only to be waved away with a cold smile from the flight attendant. The humiliation would be unbearable, and yet so was the sound of that child's suffering. She glanced around economy and saw passengers muttering, some rolling their eyes, others stuffing earbuds in deeper. They complained about privilege, about rich men who could not control their own families, about how unfair it was to endure hours of screaming. None of them understood. None of them heard the signs. None of them recognized the cries for what they were. Elodie did, and that knowledge burned in her chest. Her journal lay open on her tray table, filled with notes she had written about child development sketches, of positions and techniques learned through experience. She lifted her pen, hesitated, then began to jot down the pattern of cries, the timing between them, the likely reflux triggers. It was second nature to her, the same instinct that had driven her to document every detail of Luke's struggles years ago. She shut the notebook quickly, pulse racing. What use were notes if she could not cross that curtain? She looked toward the front of the cabin where the heavy fabric divided the worlds. Beyond it, a father was drowning in helplessness, a child was trapped in pain, and she sat powerless with the answer locked inside her. Her mind whispered doubts in rapid succession. You are nobody. You will embarrass yourself. They will laugh at your accent. They will tell you to sit down. She pressed her gloved hands together to stop their trembling, and yet another voice, quieter but stronger, rose in defiance. If you stay silent, that child continues to suffer, just as Luke once did. You saved him because you refused to give up. Will you abandon this one? She remembered Luke's small body pressed against hers the night she finally discovered the koala hold. The way his cries had quieted into soft hiccups. She remembered her mother's tears of gratitude, the way she whispered that Elodie had given her strength to keep working. That memory filled her with both dread and determination. She knew she could help. She also knew that stepping forward would mean exposing herself to ridicule, to rejection, to a world that did not welcome voices like hers. The cries from first class intensified again, echoing like a plea. Elodie's nails dug into her palms. Her decision loomed closer, her courage untested. She drew a breath that shuddered in her chest, her eyes fixed on the curtain, the invisible wall between privilege and obscurity. Beside Elodie, in the dimly lit economy cabin, sat an older woman with silver streaks in her hair and eyes that seemed to carry decades of wisdom. Mrs. Henderson had watched the young traveler for hours, noting the way her shoulders tensed with each cry from first class, the way her gloved hands twitched as if resisting action. She had not missed the quick scribbles in the notebook, nor the flush of anxiety when Elodie snapped it shut. Mrs. Henderson was no stranger to such tension. For 40 years, she had practiced as a pediatrician in a busy American hospital, guiding parents through nights of fear and uncertainty. Now retired, she traveled occasionally to visit grandchildren, her pace slower, but her instincts as sharp as ever. She leaned closer, her voice soft, but carrying a weight that drew Elodie's startled gaze. "You know what is wrong with that baby, do you not?" Elodie's lips parted, her first instinct denial, but the older woman's eyes left no room for pretense. "I can see it in the way you listen, in the way you hold your breath at every pitch change. That is not the reaction of someone annoyed. That is the reaction of someone who understands." Elodie's chest tightened. Her English carried the gentle rhythm of France, as she whispered that she had cared for her brother with similar struggles, that she recognized the pattern but feared no one would take her seriously. She lowered her eyes, ashamed of her hesitation. Mrs. Henderson reached out, laying a weathered hand over Elodie's trembling one. "My dear, the greatest mistake of my life was silence. I once saw a child in distress on a train, and though I recognized the signs, I convinced myself someone else would act. By the time help arrived, it was too late. I have carried that regret for 20 years. She paused, her gaze unwavering. "Do not repeat my mistake. Courage is not waiting for permission. It is stepping forward when a child needs you." The words pierced through Elodie's doubts. She felt the sting of tears gathering in her eyes, her heart pounding faster. Still, she whispered her fear of rejection, of being humiliated by wealthy passengers who lived in another world. Mrs. Henderson squeezed her hand firmly. "Let them laugh if they wish. A child's peace is worth your dignity 1,000 times over. I have watched you for hours. You know more than they do, even if you cannot display a certificate to prove it." Elodie swallowed hard, torn between fear and duty. The curtain at the front of the cabin loomed like a fortress wall, guarded by uniformed attendants who already seemed stretched thin. She imagined walking forward, being stopped, being told to sit down. But Mrs. Henderson's voice anchored her. "You may be a stranger here, but that baby does not know borders or class. She only knows pain, and you have the gift to end it. If you let fear win, both you and she suffer. If you stand, you will change everything." The older woman's hand did not waver, steadying her, empowering her. In that moment, Elodie realized this was no longer about comfort or embarrassment. It was about choosing whether to remain invisible or to step into the light. She breathed deeply, forcing her spine straight, and nodded slowly. Mrs. Henderson's lined face softened into a smile, pride glinting in her eyes. "That is it, dear. Go. Show them what true knowledge looks like." The cries from first class sharpened once more, echoing like a summons across the cabin. Passengers shifted, irritated, but Elodie rose from her seat, her notebook clutched in one trembling hand, her courage borrowed from the woman who believed in her when she did not believe in herself. Elodie stood on unsteady legs, the plane vibrating beneath her feet, as if testing her resolve. Her notebook trembled in her grip, the cries from the front of the aircraft pulling her forward with invisible force. Every instinct screamed to sit back down, to remain invisible, to let someone else intervene. But Mrs. Henderson's words echoed inside her like a drumbeat. Courage is not waiting for permission. It is stepping forward when a child needs you. She took her first step down the narrow aisle, the eyes of nearby passengers following her with surprise and curiosity. The heavy burgundy curtain that separated economy from first class loomed ahead, a thick fabric barrier that symbolized everything she was not supposed to cross. Her palms grew damp inside her compression gloves as she reached out and brushed the edge of the curtain. Before she could slip through, Veronica appeared like a sentinel. Her smile as polished as her uniform, her body angled to block the way. "Excuse me, ma'am. First class is restricted to ticketed passengers only," she said in a voice as smooth as glass. "Please return to your seat." Elodie swallowed her voice, small but steady. "The baby," she said, "I think I can help." Veronica's smile tightened, her eyes hardening, though her tone remained professional. "Our crew is trained for all passenger needs. Thank you for your concern, but please take your seat." Behind her, the cries of Clara rose another octave, desperate and ragged. The sound tore at Elodie's chest, pulling memories of her brother gasping against her shoulder years ago. She tried again, her French accent thickening with urgency. "I have cared for children with sensory issues. I know positions that relieve reflux. Please let me show you." Veronica's hand lifted slightly, her stance commanding. "That will not be necessary. We have protocols." The words stung a dismissal, layered with the authority of someone who believed in hierarchy above compassion. Passengers in the first-class rows turned their heads, some with irritation, some with faint curiosity. Adrian sat in the middle of it all, his shoulders hunched, his face pale with exhaustion, as he tried once more to calm Clara. For a fleeting moment, his eyes met Elodie's through the narrow gap in the curtain. His gaze was raw, a silent plea masked beneath pride and despair. Her courage nearly faltered, but then Mrs. Henderson's voice rang out behind her, strong and unyielding. "This young woman knows what she is doing." Veronica turned, startled, to see the older woman standing in the aisle, her retired medical identification card catching the cabin light like a seal of authority. "I was a pediatrician for 40 years, Mrs. Henderson continued, "and I have been watching her listen to that baby's cries. She recognizes symptoms most doctors miss." Adrian's weary eyes flicked from the elderly woman to the trembling tourist before him. His pride warred with desperation. He had spent 3 hours failing, 3 hours watching his daughter suffer, 3 hours facing judgment from strangers. Slowly, his defenses cracked. He adjusted Clara in his arms and spoke, his voice raw. "You can try," he said, "but I will supervise everything you do." The cabin held its breath. Veronica stiffened, her authority challenged, but she could not overrule the father of the child. She stepped aside reluctantly, though the stiffness of her posture betrayed her displeasure. Elodie slipped through the curtain, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it would drown out Clara's cries. She stood before Adrian Blackwood, a man whose face had graced magazines whose wealth spanned continents. Yet in this moment he looked nothing like power. He looked like a father on the verge of breaking. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at each other, two people from different worlds, united by the sound of an infant in distress. Then Elodie inhaled deeply, summoning every ounce of steady calm she had learned in nights of sleepless caregiving, and held out her hand slightly. "May I?" she asked softly. Not demanding, not commanding, simply offering. Adrian hesitated, clutching Clara tighter, as if she were the last tether to his late wife. But the child wailed again, her face blotchy with exhaustion. and his resolve collapsed. He shifted just enough for Elodie to demonstrate, watching her closely, as though memorizing every movement. Around them, the cabin leaned in passengers, forgetting their grievances as curiosity replaced annoyance. The divide between wealth and economy blurred in that moment. All eyes were fixed on the French tourist who had dared to cross it. Her bravery measured not in status or money, but in her willingness to act when others hesitated. Elodie steadied her breath as she guided Adrien to shift Clara upright against his chest, her hands hovering close, but not taking control, showing rather than commanding. "Hold her like this," she whispered gently, adjusting the angle of the infant's body until the small head rested on Adrien's collarbone, her airway clear, her stomach relieved of pressure. It is called the koala position. It helps children with reflux to breathe easier. Adrien followed with stiff, tired movements, his eyes locked on her every gesture. For the first time in hours, Clara's cries broke into hiccuping gasps, a fragile pause that made the entire cabin lean forward in anticipation. Elodie reached into her satchel and pulled out her phone, opening the sign language app she often practiced with. She lifted her hands in calm, simple shapes. Children with sensory issues often respond to visual cues. She explained softly, her French accent lending warmth to her words. Look at her eyes, they follow movement, even when sound overwhelms. Clara's frantic gaze, still wet with tears, tracked Elodie's fingers as they moved slowly in front of her face. The wails softened into shaky whimpers. A hush spread across the first-class cabin. Adrien's breath caught his arms tightening protectively around his daughter, as if afraid the fragile piece would vanish. "Is this real?" he murmured, his voice rough. Elodie nodded, pressing her gloved hands gently against Clara's back, finding the pressure points she had memorized long ago. These spots help regulate nerves and ease breathing. She pressed with delicate precision, her movements instinctive, born from years of comforting her brother. Clara's cries dissolved into tiny hiccups, then a weak sigh, then silence. The child's body relaxed against Adrien's chest, her small hand curling in the fabric of his shirt. The transformation was so swift and so complete, it felt like witnessing a miracle. A collective exhale filled the cabin. Someone began to clap softly before being hushed by awe. Adrien looked down at his daughter, then back at Elodie, his eyes glistening with something far more vulnerable than exhaustion. "Thank you," he whispered, the words carrying a weight that seemed to fall straight from his heart. Elodie smiled faintly, relief flooding her. She had crossed the barrier-faced humiliation and instead brought peace to a child who needed it most. Yet as she stepped back, Adrien shook his head. "No, please stay," he said, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. The invitation carried unspoken acknowledgement. "You belong here." Elodie hesitated, but then sat slowly, her hands folded in her lap, her cheeks warm under his gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply watched Clara breathe peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling in the rhythm of sleep. Adrien broke the silence, his voice rough with honesty. "I have read every book on fatherhood. I have bought every device, and still I fail her." Elodie glanced at him, her voice low but steady. "Children do not read our books, they read our hearts." The words lingered between them, delicate and true. Adrien looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in months, he felt the weight of his grief ease. There was something in her eyes, something steady and warm, that reminded him of nights long ago when Evelyn would calm his own anxieties with a single touch. As if on cue, his smartwatch chimed softly, the lullaby recording playing again. Evelyn's voice, tender and melodic, filled the small space. Adrian stiffened, torn between pain and longing. To his shock, Elodie's lips moved with the melody humming along as though she knew the rhythm by heart. He turned to her, astonishment flickering across his face. "How do you know this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elodie's cheeks flushed. "My grandmother sang it to my brother during his episodes. It matches the heartbeat rhythm. It calms infants." She smiled softly, her eyes lowering. "It seems love and science sometimes overlap." Adrian stared at her. As Clara's breathing synchronized with the tune, her small body relaxing deeper into slumber. He felt a jolt in his chest, a spark he had not allowed himself to feel since Evelyn's death. Something about this stranger, this French tourist with gentle hands and quiet authority, was breaking through the walls he had built around his grief. Around them, the passengers exchanged glances of amazement, some recording discreetly, others wiping away tears. Even Veronica stood stiffly in the aisle, her professional mask faltering, as her authority crumbled before the evidence of Elodie's success. Adrian leaned closer, his voice lower, meant only for Elodie. "I do not understand how you did that, but it feels like you gave me back my daughter tonight." She met his eyes, her own shining with quiet conviction. "No," she said softly, "she was always here. She only needed to feel safe." The air between them thickened with something unspoken. Adrian's hand brushed Elodie's as they adjusted Clara together, the contact brief but electric. He froze, then pulled back quickly, but not before he saw the faint blush rise on her cheeks. For a moment, the world outside their small space seemed to vanish. They were no longer billionaire and tourist, no longer divided by status or culture. They were simply two souls who had found each other through the cry of a child. Adrian inhaled deeply, the first true breath he had taken all night. His gaze lingered on her longer than propriety, allowed his voice rough with gratitude and something deeper. "Merci," he whispered, surprising himself with the foreign word. Elodie's lips curved, her accent wrapping around her reply with gentle teasing. "You speak French, Mr. Blackwood?" "Only the words that matter," he admitted, and for the first time in years he smiled with genuine warmth. The tension in the cabin melted into something else, a collective awareness that something extraordinary had happened. Clara slept soundly, the miracle complete. But the true transformation was unfolding in the silent exchange between her father and the stranger who had dared to step forward. The hush in the cabin did not last. For a brief, fragile moment, it seemed as though calm had returned. But then the aircraft shuddered violently as turbulence struck. The seatbelt signs flickered on trays, rattled and startled. Gasps rippled through the first-class cabin. Clara, startled from her shallow sleep, jerked awake and released a shrill cry that cut through the tense silence. Within seconds, the other infants scattered throughout the plane responded in sympathetic distress, their cries building into a chorus that spread from front to back. The fragile peace dissolved into chaos once more. Adrian's arms tightened instinctively around Clara, his heart pounding as he tried to repeat the techniques Elodie had shown him, but his trembling hands betrayed him. His mind raced with fear as passengers groaned and muttered angrily. He could hear phones being lifted, screens glowing as people began recording their lenses. pointed not only at the crying infant, but at the young woman beside him. Veronica's heels clicked sharply on the carpet. As she moved down the aisle, her voice pitched lower this time, aimed at a cluster of well-dressed passengers near the bulkhead. "She is not trained," she whispered, her smile never faltering. "She is just a tourist playing nurse." This disruption could compromise the safety of the cabin. Several passengers nodded, their brows furrowed. One of them, a man in a tailored navy suit, pulled out his phone and began typing furiously. Another, a social media influencer, recognizable by her perfectly styled hair and ring light tucked into her carry-on, lifted her camera and began speaking in hushed tones. #chaos at 37,000 feet, she murmured, eyes glittering at the thought of viral content. Elodie felt the shift instantly. The supportive silence she had briefly earned was crumbling under the weight of doubt and authority. Her stomach tightened as she heard Veronica's words echoing like poison. Just a tourist, no credentials, not trained. The labels stung because they were true in a way. She had no degree, no official title, only lived experience. But Clara's desperate cries reminded her that knowledge is not always measured by certificates. Adrian's eyes flicked between Elodie and Veronica, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. His instincts screamed to protect his daughter, yet his pride whispered doubt. Could he truly trust this stranger with his child again? Before the question could take root, the sound of notifications began buzzing across the cabin. The man in the navy suit had already posted a video of the scene, tagging the airline and adding his complaint about safety being compromised. Within minutes, his post spread passengers whispering that it was already being shared thousands of times. Another passenger filmed Elodie cradling Clara's tiny hand, captioning it with "French tourist hero" or "reckless interference, you decide." The hashtags multiplied as the plane sped through the night sky, the storm of opinion growing even before they landed. Passengers in economy craned their necks to peek past the curtain murmurs, spreading as they checked their phones and saw the situation trending on Twitter and TikTok. French tourist hero clashed with Chowke crew bias, and the arguments escalated. Some praised the courage of a young woman stepping forward when no one else could, while others criticized the airline for allowing an untrained stranger near a distressed child. Elodie's chest tightened as she realized the entire world might soon know her name for better or worse. Clara's cries escalated again, her face turning red, her body arching violently. Adrian tried desperately to remember Elodie's instructions, his voice breaking as he whispered his daughter's name. She would not settle. The turbulence rattled again, lights flickering overhead, and the atmosphere inside the plane grew taut as a wire. Veronica reached out her hands firm as she attempted to take Clara from Adrian's arms. "Sir, for safety reasons, we must assume responsibility." Now she said, her tone crisp with authority. Adrian recoiled, his arms tightening protectively. "No," he snapped, his voice raw. "She is my daughter." His refusal triggered a wave of mutters. Passengers leaned forward, phones raised higher, capturing every word. The influencer in row 2 whispered gleefully into her camera that the confrontation was escalating. Through it all, Elodie's heart thundered. She could not remain silent, not when she knew exactly what to do. She reached out, her voice steady, despite the storm of doubt swirling around her. The turbulence overstimulated her nervous system. "We need a warm towel and white noise. Please let me help." Veronica shot her a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "This is not your responsibility. You are not part of this crew. Sit down." But before Elodie could shrink back, a voice rose from the back, of first class, strong and clear. "I watched her calm that child in minutes when none of you could in hours." It was the distinguished elderly woman who had defended her earlier, standing tall, with her phone raised. "I recorded the flight attendant calling her untrained and a troublemaker. The video is already online and thousands of people have seen it." Gasps rippled through the cabin, heads bent over glowing screens as passengers confirmed the truth. The video was spreading like wildfire, comments pouring in from around the world in real time. People were taking sides, some defending the crew, many more championing the courage of the unknown French tourist who had done the unthinkable. A chant began softly from the economy section, then grew louder as more voices joined. "Let her continue. Let her help." The chant rolled forward until it filled the cabin, echoing through both sections of the plane. Passengers clapped, stomping lightly in rhythm, united not by status or ticket price, but by the undeniable evidence of their own eyes. Adrian looked around in stunned silence. He had lived his life in a world where image and perception mattered more than truth, yet tonight the truth was undeniable. His daughter's brief peace had come from this stranger. The chant swelled again. "Let her continue." Adrian turned back to Elodie, his decision written in the tears glistening in his eyes. "Do it," he said hoarsely, his voice cracking with emotion. "Please, save her again." Adrian's voice trembled as he uttered the plea, his arms clutching Clara as if she were the last piece of his shattered world. His composure, once legendary in boardrooms and negotiations, was gone. The billionaire mask had crumbled, leaving only a desperate father whose fear outweighed his pride. Clara screamed against his chest, her cries rising with each jolt of turbulence, her small body arching as though fighting him. Adrian's hands shook as he tried to follow Elodie's earlier guidance, but panic made his movements clumsy, ineffective. He looked at her, his eyes raw and unguarded. "I did everything exactly as you showed me." He whispered despair, thick in his throat. "Why is it not working now?" Elodie leaned closer, her hands hovering over his trembling fingers, her voice calm but resolute. "You are performing the techniques, yes, but Clara feels what you feel. Your hands shake because your heart trembles. She does not need perfection from you. She needs your peace." Adrian's chest heaved. He lowered his head, his forehead almost touching Clara's small crown, and confessed words he had buried for months. "What if I cannot give her that? What if I am not enough? What if I fail her the same way I failed Evelyn?" The name of his late wife slipped out like a wound reopening, and the cabin stilled around him. Even Veronica froze her protests, silenced by the naked pain in his voice. For a moment there was no turbulence, no chanting passengers, no buzzing phones. There was only the broken sound of a man confronting his deepest fear. Elodie reached out, placing her hand gently over his, steadying his grip on Clara. Her touch was firm but tender, her eyes holding his with quiet conviction. "The only way you could fail her is by letting your fear teach her how to be afraid. Right now she feels every tremor in you. What she needs is to feel your love." She guided his hand, slowly pressing his palm against Clara's back, in rhythm with the lullaby, still faintly playing from his smartwatch. "Count with me," she whispered, her French accent softening each word. "Let your breathing match the song." Adrian inhaled shakily, exhaled with effort, and followed her count. 1, 2, 3, breathe. 1, 2, 3, breathe. Slowly, the ragged rise of his chest steadied. His grip on Clara became less desperate, more sure, more gentle. The child stirred her cries, faltering as her father's heartbeat slowed beneath her ear. Elodie continued softly, her hand over his, her voice like an anchor in the storm. Love her with calm, not fear. Let her know she is safe, because you are safe. Tears welled in Adrian's eyes. For months he had lived under the shadow of Evelyn's absence, terrified that his love could never replace hers, that he was destined to fail. Now a stranger told him that love was enough, that calm was strength. He blinked hard, his vision blurring, as Clara's screams softened into uneven whimpers, then quiet hiccups. Around them, the cabin was silent, passengers watching in awe, as the billionaire known for ruthless efficiency learned the art of tenderness. Clara nestled closer into his chest, her small hand gripping the edge of his shirt as her breathing synced with his. Adrian's tears fell freely, dampening her hair. "I am so sorry, my darling," he whispered into her ear, his voice breaking. "I thought I had to be perfect. I only needed to be here." His words trembled, yet they carried the weight of a man who had finally laid down his armor. Elodie's eyes softened. She reached up and brushed a stray lock of hair from Clara's damp forehead, her hand grazing Adrian's wrist for a fleeting second. The contact sent an unexpected warmth rushing through him, startling yet grounding. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to hold still. In her gaze, Adrian saw no judgment, no pity, only understanding. And in that understanding, something sparked fragile but undeniable. He felt it not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet ignition, a reminder that even in grief, life could stir again. Clara exhaled in a long sigh, her small body sinking fully into sleep, her face peaceful for the first time since takeoff. Adrian's sob escaped as both relief and revelation, his entire frame sagging under the release. Passengers in both cabins burst into applause, but he barely heard them. His focus was on the tiny weight in his arms, and the woman beside him who had shown him a truth he had been too afraid to face. He turned to Elodie, his voice hoarse but filled with reverence. "You saved her. You saved me." She shook her head gently. "No, she said you saved her the moment you let go of fear. I only reminded you of what you already carried." Adrian swallowed, overwhelmed. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, truly seeing. Not as a stranger, not as a tourist, but as someone who had entered his chaos with courage and left light in its wake. The applause continued, phones flashed, but in that moment, Adrian did not care about headlines or trending hashtags. He cared only about the fragile piece in his arms and the quiet strength seated beside him. The silence that followed was fragile, the kind that comes only after a storm has raged and finally broken. Clara slept soundly against Adrian's chest, her tiny hand curled into the fabric of his shirt. Around them, the cabin buzzed with astonishment. Passengers who had been groaning hours earlier now leaned forward, their phones raised, their faces softened with wonder. The applause that had begun timidly swelled again, louder this time, rolling like a tide through both cabins. In that wave of sound, Adrian lifted his head, his face wet with tears, but his eyes blazing with a new steadiness. He rose slightly in his seat, careful not to wake Clara, and addressed the room in a voice that carried authority, but also raw sincerity. "Ladies and gentlemen, I know you all expected peace tonight, and instead endured chaos. I cannot apologize enough for what my daughter and I put you through. But I must tell you something important." His gaze swept the room, landing finally on Elodie. This young woman did not just calm my baby when no one else could. She reminded me that being a father is not about perfection, it is about love. She taught me to lead from my heart instead of my fear. He paused, his voice thickening with emotion. And for that she saved not only my child, but me as well. The cabin erupted in thunderous applause, the kind that echoed through every row, passengers standing, now clapping with genuine fervor. The influencer who had been filming wiped her eyes as she streamed the moment live, her commentary, no longer cynical, but reverent. "Look at this," she whispered into her camera. A billionaire father admitting vulnerability. A tourist stepping in to save the day. A whole cabin united by compassion. This is history in the making. The elderly woman who had defended Elodie earlier rose again, her phone held high. "I told you all," she said with pride. "This girl is no troublemaker. She is the reason that child is safe. My video is already viral. The hashtags are trending. People across the world are watching this unfold in real time." Passengers gasped as they refreshed their feeds. On every screen, the story was exploding. French tourist saves baby, flight attendant bias exposed. Hashtag French tourist hero. Hashtag crew bias. Comments flooded in by the thousands strangers, praising courage parents, sharing their own stories of reflux and sleepless nights. Activists decrying prejudice in the air. Veronica stood frozen, her professional mask cracking her earlier words, now echoing against her like accusations. She glanced at Elodie, shame flickering across her face, but for the moment she could not move. Adrian remained standing, his daughter nestled against him, his voice strong with gratitude. "She belongs here," he said, gesturing toward Elodie with reverence. "She belongs in this cabin, in this conversation, in this moment." Because tonight she reminded us all that class and money mean nothing when a child needs comfort. Only courage matters. Passengers erupted once more, clapping and cheering, some shouting encouragements in French when they learned her name. Elodie felt her cheeks flush hot, her eyes prick with tears. For the first time in her life, she was not invisible, not dismissed, not pushed aside. She was seen, truly seen, by an entire plane of witnesses and by thousands watching online. Clara stirred softly, her lips parting in a faint sound that was almost like gratitude. The sight made Adrian's heart twist with awe. He looked at Elodie, and in his eyes glowed not only respect, but something deeper, something tentative but undeniable. In that instant, the chaos of hours past transformed into a story larger than any one of them. It was no longer about a crying baby or a restless cabin. It was about humanity choosing to side with compassion over judgment, with courage over indifference. And at the center of it all stood a shy French tourist whose quiet bravery had turned a night of misery into a lesson the world would not soon forget. As the applause slowly faded, the cabin settled into a hum of admiration and whispered conversations. Adrian eased back into his seat, with Clara sleeping peacefully in his arms, his entire body sagging with relief. Beside him, Elodie sat stiff with disbelief, her notebook still clutched against her lap, as though she might wake to discover all of it had been a dream. Adrian turned toward her, his gaze steady and intent. "You should not go back to economy," he said quietly, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. "Please stay here. It was not just an invitation, it was an acknowledgement. For a moment, Elodie hesitated, then slid into the seat, her heart racing, as if she had stepped into a world she was never meant to enter. They sat together in silence, watching Clara's chest rise and fall. The intimacy of the moment grew heavier until Adrian finally spoke again, his voice low and vulnerable. "Since Evelyn passed, I have lived in fear that I could never be enough for Clara. Fear that I would break under the weight of being both father and mother. Tonight you showed me something I will never forget." He glanced at her, his eyes glistening. "You reminded me that love does not need to be perfect, it only needs to be present." Elodie swallowed hard, her own eyes shining. She told him about her brother Luke, about the nights she walked the floor, rocking him while her mother worked, and about how she learned by necessity, not by textbooks. Adrian listened closely, as if each word revealed another piece of the puzzle connecting their worlds. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice further. "After we land, I want to discuss something with you. I have resources that could support your studies, your research, your dreams. But more than that, I want Clara to know people like you, people who understand life beyond privilege." Elodie's breath caught the weight of his offer, pressing on her chest. She shook her head instinctively. "I have no official training," she whispered. Adrian's lips curved faintly, his eyes soft. "Tonight you proved that experience is the highest credential." From behind them, Mrs. Henderson approached her face alight with pride. She pressed a small leather-bound notebook into Elodie's hands. "This is filled with observations from my years in pediatrics," she said, her voice trembling. "I always dreamed of passing it to someone who would use it with both knowledge and heart. I believe that is you." Elodie's throat closed with emotion as she accepted the gift. Veronica stood nearby, her face pale with shame. She drew a slow breath and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Miss Laurent, I owe you an apology. I misjudged you. I let class bias cloud my judgment. I was wrong." Her words carried no excuses, only contrition. Elodie nodded her acceptance with quiet grace, her reply soft but firm. "Thank you, it takes courage to admit mistakes." Adrian's respect for her deepened further. His eyes lingered on her longer than necessary. His gratitude threaded with something unspoken. He whispered so only she could hear. "Clara and I could use a friend, someone who understands. Would you consider staying in Paris a few extra days after your program?" The question hung between them, carrying more than logistical weight. Elodie's cheeks warmed as she met his gaze. "Perhaps," she said quietly, her voice trembling with possibility. Clara stirred at that moment, lifting a tiny hand that reached instinctively toward Elodie's fingers, gripping them with surprising strength. Adrian smiled softly. "It seems she has already decided." 6 months later, the spring air in Paris was alive with birdsong and the scent of blooming chestnut trees. The Luxembourg gardens glowed with soft sunlight, children's laughter drifting across the manicured lawns. Near a fountain where golden fish darted in circles, Elodie Laurent walked slowly, her white lab coat catching the light. Embroidered neatly on the pocket were the words "Elodie Laurent Child Development Specialist." She carried a stack of research notes in one hand, and Mrs. Henderson's worn leather notebook in the other, its pages now filled with her own annotations. Her heart swelled with pride every time she saw her name, stitched on the fabric, every time she signed a paper with the silver pen the older woman had entrusted to her. Across the park, a familiar figure pushed a stroller along the gravel path, his tall frame instantly recognizable. Adrian Blackwood had traded his suit for a simple shirt and rolled sleeves, yet he still carried an air of confidence softened now by something gentler. Clara sat in the stroller waving a small stuffed rabbit, her laughter ringing out as her father lifted her high into the air. He spun her gently, the sound of her joy echoing across the gardens. When he spotted Elodie waiting by the fountain, his face broke into a smile that lit his eyes with warmth. He carried Clara over, settling her into Elodie's arms, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Clara reached for Elodie's hair with delighted curiosity, babbling happily. Adrian watched them together, his expression filled with gratitude and something deeper that words rarely touched. Since that night on the plain, their lives had intertwined in ways neither could have predicted. Adrian had funded Elodie's research project on sensory care for infants, providing resources she once thought impossible. Her work had already published its first breakthrough paper, drawing international attention for its innovative approach. Parents across Europe reached out to her center seeking guidance and comfort. Mrs. Henderson visited often, her eyes shining with pride as she saw her once quiet student become the researcher she had long dreamed of being. Veronica, too, had changed, requesting transfer to flights that focused on families and using her story as a lesson in training programs about compassion and humility. The world had not forgotten either. The video of that night continued to circulate, not as a scandal, but as an inspiration. It had become a symbol of courage, compassion, and the power of unlikely heroes. People still recognized Elodie occasionally in cafes or on the metro, thanking her for reminding them that expertise can come from the most unexpected places. But for Elodie, the truest reward was here in the park, with Clara's small hands gripping her finger with absolute trust. Adrian stood close, his voice soft but certain. "You know Sarah would have loved you," he said quietly. Naming his late wife without pain, this time but with reverence. She always believed the best caregivers were not the ones with the most degrees, but the ones with the biggest hearts. Elodie's throat tightened with emotion as she pressed a kiss to Clara's dark curls. Clara looked up at her, then at Adrian, her small lips forming a tentative sound. "Mama." The word was fragile, imperfect, but unmistakable. Adrian froze his eyes, widening, his breath catching. Elodie's heart stumbled in her chest. She looked at Adrian, then at Clara, uncertain what to say, but Clara reached again, her little voice insistent. "Mama." Adrian's gaze softened with awe, his eyes shimmering. He whispered, "She has chosen." Elodie smiled through tears, shaking her head gently. "Not yet," she murmured, but the warmth in her eyes promised possibility. The future stretched before them, unwritten but alive with hope. As the afternoon sun bathed the gardens in golden light, Adrian slipped his hand into Elodie's, their fingers intertwining naturally. Clara squealed with delight, clapping her tiny hands as if sealing the bond. The story that began with cries in a cabin now unfolded into laughter. In a garden, a reminder that sometimes one small act of courage can transform invisibility into belonging and grief into love.